Good morning. It is so windy that I'm having to shoot with the window up. So it's going to be a little bit different sound. And we may not get to hear any birds. To be fair, I can't hear any birds anyway. And I'm out here. The wind is really kicking as it's moving these clouds through. Thank you for being with me. I appreciate you. I continue with, if you've got it, flaunt it or hide it. I have been observing this constellation in interaction for more than a dozen years. I did not, however, have any understanding of why this happens until fairly recently, when I developed the framework of status and connection, an experimental study that was pivotal. Sorry about that. Okay, an experimental study that was pivotal in my thinking shows that expertise does not ensure women a place at center stage in conversation with men. Psychologist H.M. Leet Pellegrini set out to discover whether gender or expertise determined who would behave in what she terms as a dominant way. For example, by talking more, interrupting, and controlling the topic. She set up pairs of women and pairs of men and mixed pairs and asked them to discuss the effects of television violence on children. In some cases, she made one of the partners an expert by providing relevant, factual information and time to read and assimilate it. Let me go back. It's one of the long sentences. In some cases, she made one of the partners an expert by providing relevant, factual information and time to read and assimilate it before the videotaped discussion. One might expect that the conversationalist, who was the expert, would talk more, interrupt more, and spend less time supporting the conversational partner who knew less about the subject. But it was not so simple. On the average, those who had expertise did talk more, but men experts talked more than women experts. Expertise also had a different effect on women and men with regard to supportive behavior. Leet Pellegrini expected that the one who did not have expertise would spend more time offering agreement and support to the one who did. This turned out to be true, except in cases where a woman was the expert and her non-expert partner was a man. In this situation, the woman expert showed support, saying things like, yeah, and that's right, far more than the non-expert men they were talking to. Observers often rated the male non-expert as more dominant than the female expert. In other words, the women in this experiment not only didn't wield their expertise as power, but tried to play it down and make up for it through extra assenting behavior. They acted as if their expertise were something to hide. And perhaps it was. When the word expert was spoken in these experimental conversations, in all cases but one, it was the man in the conversation who used it, saying something like, "So, you're the expert." Evidence of the woman's superior knowledge sparked resentment, not respect. Furthermore, when an expert man talked to an uninformed woman, he took a controlling role in structuring the conversation in the beginning and the end. But when an expert man talked to an uninformed man, he dominated in the beginning, but not always in the end. In other words, having expertise was enough to keep a man in the controlling position if he was talking to a woman, but not if he was talking to a man. Apparently, when a woman surmised that the man she was talking to had more information on the subject than she did, she simply accepted the reactive role. But another man, despite a lack of information, might still give the expert a run for his money and possibly gain the upper hand by the end. Reading these results, I suddenly understood what happens to me when I talk to women and men about language. I am assuming that my acknowledged expertise will mean I am automatically accorded authority in the conversation, and with women that is generally the case. But when I talk to men, revealing that I have acknowledged expertise in this area often invites challenges. I might maintain my position if I defend myself successfully against the challenges, but if I don't, I may lose ground. One interpretation of the Leet Pellegrini study is that women are getting a bum deal. They don't get credit when it's due. And in a way, this is true. But the reason is not as it seems to many women. The men are bums who seek to deny women authority. The Leet Pellegrini study shows that many men are inclined to jockey for status and challenge the authority of others when they are talking to men too. If this is so, then challenging a woman's authority as they would challenge a man's could be a sign of respect and equal treatment, rather than lack of respect and discrimination. In cases where this is so, the inequality of the treatment results not simply from the man's behavior alone, but from the differences in men's and women's styles. Most women lack experience in defending themselves against challenges, which they misinterpret as personal attacks on their credibility. Even when talking to men who are happy to see them in positions of status, women may have a hard time getting their due because of differences in men's and women's interactional goals. Just as boys in high school are not inclined to repeat information about popular girls because it doesn't get them what they want, women in conversation are not inclined to display their knowledge because it doesn't get them what they are after. Leet Pellegrini suggests that the men in this study were playing a game of "Have I won?" while the women were playing a game of "Have I been sufficiently helpful?" I am inclined to put this another way. The game women play is "Do you like me?" whereas the men play "Do you respect me?" If men, in seeking respect, are less liked by women, this is an unsought side effect, as is the effect that women, in seeking to be liked, may lose respect. When a woman has a conversation with a man, her efforts to emphasize their similarities and avoid showing off can easily be interpreted through the lens of status as relegating her to a one-down position, making her appear either incompetent or insecure. And the next section is called the subtle deference. Oh, there's my eagle. Doing eagle stuff. Oh my goodness. I'm going to resituate here. There's that sun finally breaking through. The subtle deference. Elizabeth Aries, a professor of psychology at Amherst College, set out to show that highly intelligent, highly educated young women are no longer submissive in conversations with male peers. And indeed, she found that the college women did talk more than the college men in small groups that she set up. But what they said was different. The men tended to set the agenda by offering opinions, suggestions, and information. The women tended to react, offering agreement or disagreement. Furthermore, she found that body language was as different as ever. The men sat with their legs stretched out, while the women gathered themselves in, noting that research has found that speakers using the open-bodied position are more likely to persuade their listeners. Aries points out that talking more may not ensure that women will be heard. In another study, Aries found that men in all male discussion groups spent a lot of time at the beginning finding out who was best informed about movies, books, current events, politics, and travel as a means of sizing up the competition and negotiating where they stood in relation to each other. This glimpse of how men talk when there are no women present gives an inkling of why displaying knowledge and expertise is something that men find more worth doing than women. What the women in Aries' studies spent time doing was gaining a closeness through more intimate self-revelation. Excuse me. It is crucial to bear in mind that both men and women, and the men in these studies, were establishing camaraderie, and both were concerned with their relationships to each other. But different aspects of their relationships were of primary concern: their place in a hierarchical order for the men, and their place in a network of intimate connections for the women. The consequence of these disparate concerns was very different ways of speaking. Thomas Fox is an English professor who was intrigued by the differences between women and men in his freshman writing classes. What he observed corresponds almost precisely to the experimental findings of Aries and Leet Pellegrini. Fox's method of teaching writing included having all the students read their essays to each other in class and then talk to each other in small groups. He also had them write papers reflecting on the essays and the discussion groups. He alone, as the teacher, read these analytical papers. To exemplify the two styles he found typical of women and men, Fox chose a woman, Mrs. M, and a man, Mr. H. Mrs. M and Mr. H. In her speaking as well as her writing, Miss M held back what she knew, appearing uninformed and uninterested because she feared offending her classmates. Mr. H spoke and wrote with authority and apparent confidence because he was eager to persuade his peers. She did not worry about persuading, and he did not worry about offending. In this analytical paper, the young man described his own behavior in the mixed gender group discussions, as if he were describing the young men in Leet Pellegrini's and Aries' studies. Here's what he says. In my subgroup, I am the leader. I begin every discussion by stating my opinions as facts. The other two members of the subgroup tend to sit back and agree with me. I need people to agree with me. Fox comments that Mr. H reveals, quote, a sense of self one that acts to change himself and other people, that seems entirely distinct from Miss M's sense of self, dependent on and related to others. End quote. Calling Miss M's sense of self dependent suggests a negative view of her way of being in the world, and I think a view more typical of men. Excuse me. This view reflects the assumption that the alternative to independence is dependence. If this is indeed a male view, it may explain why so many men are cautious about becoming intimately involved with others. It makes sense to avoid humiliating dependence by insisting on independence. But there is another alternative: interdependence. I know no one brings this one up very often. It's always your, dependent or independent. Interdependence is also a word. Just saying. Shout out to my brother. That's a real word, brother. All right. The main difference between these alternatives is symmetry. It's when things match. Dependence is an asymmetrical involvement. One person needs the other, but not vice versa. So the needy person is one down. Interdependence is symmetrical. Both parties rely on each other, so neither is one up or one down. Moreover, Mr. H's sense of self is also dependent on others. He requires others to listen, to agree, and allow him to take the lead by stating his opinions first. Now, if you look at it this way, the woman and the man in this group are both dependent on each other. Their differing goals are complementary, although neither understands the reasons for the other's behavior. This would be a fine arrangement, except that their differing goals result in alignments that enhance his authority and undercut hers. All right, the next category: different interpretations and misinterpretations. Fox also describes differences in the way male and female students in his class interpreted a story they read. He describes differences in the way male and female students in his class interpreted a story they read. These differences also reflect assumptions about the interdependence or independence of individuals. Fox's students wrote their responses to The Birthmark by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In the story, a woman's husband becomes obsessed with a birthmark on her face. Suffering from her husband's revulsion at the sight of her, the wife becomes obsessed with it too, and in a reversal of her initial impulse, agrees to undergo a treatment he has devised to remove the birthmark, a treatment that succeeds in removing the mark, but kills her in the process. Miss M interpreted the wife's complicity as a natural response to the demand of a loved one. The woman went along with her husband's lethal schemes to remove the birthmark because she wanted to please him and be appealing to him. Now, Mr. H blamed the woman's insecurity and vanity for her fate, and he blamed her for voluntarily submitting to her husband's authority. Now, Fox points out that he saw her as individually responsible for her actions, just as he saw himself as individually responsible for his own actions. To him, the issue was independence. The weak wife voluntarily took a submissive role. To Miss M, the issue was interdependence. The woman was inextricably bound up with her husband, so she behaves. The woman was inextricably bound up with her husband, so her behavior could not be separated from his. Fox observes that Mr. H saw the writing of the women in the class as spontaneous. They wrote whatever popped into their heads. Nothing could be further from Miss M's experience as she described it. When she knew her peers would see her writing, she censored everything that popped into her head. In contrast, when she was writing something that only her professor would read, she expressed firm and articulate opinions. There is a striking but paradoxical complementarity to Miss M and Mr. H's styles when they are taken together. He needs someone to listen and agree. She listens and agrees. But in another sense, their dovetailing purposes are at cross purposes. He misinterprets her agreement, intended in a spirit of connection, as a reflection of status and power. He thinks she is indecisive and insecure. Her reasons for refraining from behaving as he does, firmly stating opinions as facts, have nothing to do with her attitudes towards her knowledge, as he thinks they do, but rather result from her attitude towards her relationship with her peers. These experimental studies by Leet, Pellegrini, and Aries, and the observations by Fox, all indicate that, typically, men are more comfortable than women in giving information and opinions, and speaking in an authoritative way to a group, whereas women are more comfortable than men in supporting others. All right, the next one. Is anybody listening? In Jules Feiffer's play, Grown Ups, a woman, Marilyn, tries to tell her parents, Jack and Helen, about something that happened to her, but she never succeeds in getting them to listen. Her explicit attempts to tell her story are highlighted by the bold-face type. I'm going to read it. Marilyn, Jack, and Helen. Marilyn's the woman. Jack and Helen are the parents. Excuse me. Marilyn says, "You got to hear this. I was coming home Wednesday on the bus from Philadelphia." Jack says, "Nobody said a word to me about Philadelphia." Helen says, "Marilyn, you want me to check the chicken for you?" Marilyn says, "Leave it, Mama." Helen, "The old lady's trying to give a hand." Marilyn, "I'm like you. If somebody starts to help, I forget what I'm doing. Sit down. You'll love this. I was coming home from Philadelphia." Jack says to Helen, "Did you know she was out of town?" Marilyn says, 2 days. Jack says, "Who took care of my grandchildren?" Marilyn says, "How should I know? Out of sight, out of mind." "No, Rudy was here. He got them out of bed in the morning and back in bed at night. In between, I don't even want to know what happened. Am I ever going to be able to tell you this or not?" Helen says, returning to the table, "You're going out of town, Marilyn?" Marilyn cannot get her parents to pay attention to her story. They continually sidetrack the narration with comments about her cooking, her housekeeping, her family, her safety, and her brother, Jake. Helen says, "Where's Jake?" Marilyn says, "On the way, so I caught the last bus back to the city." Jack says, "I don't like you taking a last bus. It's dangerous." Marilyn says, "It's not nearly as dangerous as trying to tell a story around here." Like the woman who wrote to Ann Landers that her husband does not talk to her, Marilyn feels invisible. She sees her parents' lack of interest in listening to her as symbolic of their inability to see and value her as a person, as she explains to Jake. Marilyn says, "You, at least, they know you're alive. No matter what I do, you know how it feels. I'll put it this way. If you take them someplace in your car, you're this wonderful success who can afford his own car. I take them someplace in my car, I'm the chauffeur. More than anything, you know what kills me? The thing I loved most was you and Mama in the kitchen with your stories. She'd tell one, you'd tell one, she'd tell one, you'd tell one. I thought someday I'll be old enough to have my own real experiences, and then I'll have stories. To this day, they will not allow me to tell a story. Isn't it crazy that I should still be bothered by that? Jake says. I told my stories to get away from her stories. Jake's explanation of why he told stories as a child shows his impulse to avoid being in the listening position. Whereas Marilyn loved listening to their mother's stories, Jake says he learned to hold the floor with his own stories in order to avoid listening to hers. Just as Marilyn believed that she would have stories to tell when she grew up, I recall that when I was a child there was 2 skills I thought all adults had that I didn't have: whistling and snapping their fingers. I assumed I would acquire these abilities with age and eagerly awaited the development. But I grew up and I still can't whistle or get my fingers to produce a snap worth listening to. It never occurred to me when I was a child that these skills did not magically appear, like the physical changes of puberty. I realized too late that if I wanted to know how to whistle and snap my fingers, I had to practice. The grown daughter in Grown Ups could not tell stories in a way to command attention, partly because she hadn't gotten any practice as a child. What she'd done as a child was listen attentively and appreciatively as her mother and brother told stories. While Jake was getting practice in commanding attention through verbal performance, Marilyn was getting practice in listening. The skills Marilyn and Jake honed as children provided the basis for their adult vocations. Jake became a journalist at the New York Times. He made a career of writing news stories that millions would read, another form of verbal display to an audience. Marilyn became a social worker. She made a career of listening to other people talk. In Pfeiffer's play, Marilyn really is not as good a storyteller as Jake. She gets bogged down in unimportant details and interrupts herself to fuss about accuracy when it doesn't make any difference to the story. The scene ends with Jake triumphantly holding forth, retelling to an rapt audience, a story that Marilyn had just botched. This implies that her own storytelling deficiencies are the cause of her failing to command attention. But it could well be that even if Marilyn had been able to tell a good story, her family wouldn't have listened, because they had long since come to assume that Jake tells stories and Marilyn doesn't. By the same process, since more men than women are comfortable holding forth to a crowd, it may well be that it is difficult for women to get center stage, regardless of how articulate they are, because a norm is established by which most people expect men, not women, to command attention. And the next one. Growing up invisible. Anthropologists Frederick Erikson and Susan Florio recorded a real-life conversation that could have been a blueprint for the family created by Jules Pfeiffer in Grown Ups. Erikson studied the videotape they made of a dinner table conversation of an Italian family in Boston. The youngest boy in the family had fallen off his bicycle, and he had a bruise to prove it. To comfort him, his father and brothers told him, and everyone present, about times they had fallen off of their bikes. In their stories, they didn't just fall off, they wiped out their bikes, lending an air of glamour and daring to their accidents. The longest and most impressive story was told by the father, who had the biggest bike a motorcycle. In this way, the older boys and men in the family gave the youngest brother a lesson in fearlessness as well as storytelling. Not only was doing dangerous things part of being a man, but so was crashing and telling about it before an audience of other men and appreciative women. Throughout this portion of the conversation, the boys and men told stories, while the women, the mother, the sister, and Susan Florio, the researcher guest, took the role of audience. Florio was a particularly important member of the audience because it was partly for her, an attractive young woman, that the young men were displaying their prowess at riding bikes, weathering crashes, and telling stories. When the daughter, the little boy's sister, tried to tell him about falling off her bike, nobody paid any attention to her. She never got past the first line, which is highlighted in the excerpt with boldface type. Here's some more dialogue. We got Father, Mother, Jimmy, Brother 2, Brother 3, Brother 1. Father says, he's talking about youngest brother Jimmy's bruise. That's really a good one, huh? Mother says, yeah. Jimmy says, yeah, and a scrape near the... Father says, you should keep a patch on that. Brother 2 says, go get the patch. Brother 3, the patching kit, scrape down. Kidding Jimmy by analogy with the tire patching kit. Sister says, I wiped out on my bike on the hill. Brother 1 says, last time I did it, that was a good wipeout. The next one says, something was the last time I did this. Father says, I'll have to get you a helmet too. And then Brother 1 says to Brother 2, I think one of my best wipeouts was when I hit you when I was doing about 20. The little brother's wipeout, falling off his bike, is the object of a lot of attention. But the little girl's attempt to tell about her wipeout is completely ignored, just as Marilyn finds her attempts to tell about her experience ignored by her family in Pfeiffer's play. There are many reasons this could happen. It could be the way the little girl goes about getting a turn is different. After announcing that she wiped out her bike on the hill, she may have wanted to be encouraged to continue, whereas the boys just pressed on until they got to tell their stories. She may have spoken too quietly and tentatively, or it may simply be that the family is not interested in girls' stories in general, or girls' wipeouts in particular. In his paper, Erickson shows that the wipeout stories are lessons in male behavior. Through attention to their stories, the boys are learning and demonstrating for the youngest boy that risking danger in riding a bike is good. Getting hurt is unavoidable. Sustaining injury bravely is commendable. Technical knowledge and skill can be useful. There is a lot of talk about the mechanics of brakes and the engineering of roads. And telling about risking danger, sustaining injury, and applying and displaying technical expertise is a good way to get attention and impress people. Perhaps none of these lessons are deemed relevant for the sister. In any event, the net effect is that the boys in the family are learning to hold center stage by talking. The girl in the family is learning to listen. All right, and the next one. Oh, only have a couple pages left. Listener as underling. Clearly, men are not always talking and women are not always listening. I have asked men whether they ever find themselves in the position of listening to another man giving them a lecture and how they feel about it. They tell me that this does happen. They may find themselves talking to someone who presses information on them so insistently that they give in and listen. They say they don't mind too much. However, if the information is interesting. They can store it away for future use, like remembering a joke to tell others later. Now, factual information is of less interest to women because it is of less use to them. They are unlikely to try to pass on the gift of information, more likely to give the gift of being a good audience. Men as well as women sometimes find themselves on the receiving end of a lecture they would as soon not hear. But men tell me that it is most likely to happen if the other man is in a position of a higher status. They know they have to listen to lectures from fathers and bosses. That men can find themselves in the position of unwilling listener is attested to by a short opinion piece in which A.R. Gurney bemoans being frequently cornered by some self-styled expert who harangues me with his considered opinion on an interminable agenda of topics. He claims that this tendency bespeaks a peculiarly American inability to converse, that is, engage in a balanced give and take, and cites as support the French observer of American customs, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote, "An American speaks to you as if he was addressing a meeting." Gurney credits his own appreciation of conversing to his father, who was a master at eliciting and responding enthusiastically to the views of others, though his resiliency didn't always extend to his children. Indeed, now I think about it, he spoke to us many times as if he were addressing a meeting. It is not surprising that Gurney's father lectured his children. The act of giving information, by definition, frames one in a position of higher status, while the act of listening frames one as lower. Children instinctively sense this, as do most men. But when women listen to men, they are not thinking in terms of status. Unfortunately, their attempts to reinforce connections and establish rapport, when interpreted through the lens of status, can be misinterpreted as casting them in a subordinate position, and are likely to be taken that way by men. Next category is what's so funny. The economy of exchanging jokes for laughter is a parallel one. In her study of college students' discussion groups, Aries found that the students in all male groups spent a lot of time telling about times they had played jokes on others and laughing about it. She refers to a study in which Barbara Miller Newman found that high school boys who were not quick and clever became the targets of jokes. Practical joking, playing a joke on someone, is clearly a matter of being one up. In the know and in control. It is less obvious, but no less true, that telling jokes can also be a way of negotiating status. Many women, certainly not all, laugh at jokes, but do not later remember them, since they are not driven to seek and hold center stage in a group. They do not need a store of jokes to whip out for this purpose. A woman I will call Bernice prided herself on her sense of humor. At a cocktail party, she met a man to whom she was drawn, because he seemed at first to share this trait. He made many funny remarks, which she spontaneously laughed at. But when she made funny remarks, he seemed not to hear. What had happened to his sense of humor? Though telling jokes and laughing at them are both reflections of a sense of humor, they are very different social activities. Making others laugh gives you a fleeting power over them. As linguist Wallace Chafe points out, At the moment of laughter, a person is temporarily disabled. The man Bernice met was comfortable only when he was making her laugh, not the other way around. When Bernice laughed at his jokes, she thought she was engaging in a symmetrical activity, but he was engaging in an asymmetrical one. A man told me that sometime around 10th grade he realized that he preferred the company of women to the company of men. He found that his female friends were more supportive and less competitive, whereas his male friends seemed to spend all their time joking. Considering joking an asymmetrical activity makes it clearer why it would fit in with a style he perceived as competitive. All right. Who do you think you are talking to? Next section. Subtle asymmetries in listening and speaking. Subtle asymmetries in listening and speaking may also shed light on the common complaint that men often don't talk to women at home. Jerry Philipson is an anthropologist who spent 2.5 years working among teenage boys in an urban Italian working class neighborhood. These boys were loud and loquacious when hanging around with each other on the street corner or in the local bar, but they did not talk to superiors or inferiors. If they wanted to get something from a person in a position of authority, they relied on intermediaries, just as they prayed to a saint for intercession rather than praying directly to God. To those in a subordinate position, like children, women, or boys of lower status, they got their way by a show of physical power and, if necessary, violent action. To talk to someone of higher status would be cheeky, bold, out of order. To talk to someone of lower status would be weak, ineffectual, and inviting subordination. There are two ways in which the culture of these macho teenage boys is similar to the culture of girls and women. Like girls, these boys gain status by affiliation. The more influential people they know, the more status they have. But the point of affiliation for them is power. They use their connections to get things done. For girls, affiliation is an end in itself. Their status goes up if they're friends with high-status girls. These boys are like girls, and that they talk only when they feel comfortable among peers. But why don't they want to talk to girls? Well, it may be that they assume that the girls are lower in status, whereas the girls feel or want to feel that a partner, even a male one, is a peer. Class differences may play a larger role in conversational styles than we think. Sociologist Mira Komarowski, in her classic study Blue Collar Marriage, found that the more middle class a couple was, the more the husband and wife considered each other friends. Among high school graduates, there was an expectation that a husband should talk to his wife. Among those who had not graduated from high school, wives who wanted their husbands to talk to them were thought to be inappropriately demanding. The expectation was that wives should talk to their female relatives and leave their husbands alone. And the next, mutual accusations. On register. Considering these dynamics, it is not surprising that many women complain that their partners don't listen to them. But men make the same complaint about women, although less frequently. The accusation, "you're not listening," often really means you don't understand what I'm saying in the way that I meant it, or I'm not getting the response I wanted. Being listened to can become a metaphor for being understood and being valued. In my earlier work, I emphasized that women may get the impression men are not listening to them, even when the men really are. This happens because men have different habitual ways of showing that they're listening. As anthropologists Maltz and Borker explain, women are more inclined to ask questions. They also give more listening responses. Little words like and yeah, sprinkled throughout someone else's talk, providing a running feedback loop. And they respond more positively and enthusiastically, for example, by agreeing and laughing. All this behavior is doing the work of listening. It also creates rapport talk, emphasizing connection and encouraging more talk. The corresponding strategies of men, giving fewer listener responses, making statements rather than asking questions, and challenging rather than agreeing, can be understood as moves in a contest by incipient speakers rather than audience members. Not only do women give more listening signals, according to Maltz and Borker, but the signals they give have different meanings for men and women. Consistent with the speaker-audience alignment, women use yeah to mean I'm with you, I follow, whereas men tend to say yeah only when they agree. The opportunity for misunderstanding is clear. When a man is confronted with a woman who has been saying yeah, and then turns out not to agree, he may conclude that she has been insincere, or that she was agreeing without really listening. When a woman is confronted with a man who does not say yeah or much of anything else, she may conclude that he has not been listening. The men's style is more literally focused on the message level of talk, while the women's is focused on the relationship or the meta-message level. To give a man who expects a listener to be quietly attentive, to a man who expects a listener to be quietly attentive, a woman giving a stream of feedback and support will seem to be talking too much for a listener. To a woman who expects a listener to be active and enthusiastic and showing interest, attention, and support, a man who listens silently will seem not to be listening at all, but rather to have checked out of the conversation, taking his listening marbles and gone mentally home. Because of these patterns, women may get the impression that men are not listening when they really are. But I have come to understand, more recently, that it is also true that men listen to women less frequently than women listen to men, because the act of listening has different meanings for them. Some men really don't want to listen at length because they feel it frames them as subordinate. Many women do not want to listen, but they expect it to be reciprocal. I listen to you now, you listen to me later. They become frustrated when they do the listening now, and later never ever comes. There are 3 parts left. My video's long and I'm back to, I think I'm falling asleep again. I gotta take some air. Okay. Sorry about that wind. You just don't understand. There we go. It's the book I'm reading you. Oh, look at that. Wind's a little bit better. Thank you for letting me read to you. I appreciate you.